Sideways?
Yes.
All right.
No, you can't. You live.
You have to do it.
Yeah, you can't.
Oh, okay.
It just told
hey,
me.
I don't know. Alright, all set. Top spot. We're going to dim the lights. Where are you sitting? I'm going to sit right here. Yeah, you want to sit here. All right, everyone. Welcome to Kent State for Austin Petersen. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your attendance. So my name is Kevin Klein. I am the chapter president of Young Americans for Liberty here at Kent State University. So I want to give a special project that Austin endorses a moment of your time. Unfortunately, sorry I have it, so I'm going to give it away. And they're going to come talk about the Convention of States project. It's just a couple minutes, and then I'll introduce Austin. We'll get rolling right into this thing, but it's a great project, and it definitely deserves your attention. So thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Dave Spencer. I'm the Young Americans for Convention of States National Coordinator. And for all you guys who don't know what Convention of States is we're a bipartisan grassroots organization, in fact the largest grassroots organization in the country, gaining 1,500 signers every day. And we have three goals of calling a Convention of the States. We want to call for fiscal restraints, term limits, and limiting the federal overreach and tyranny. And the reason why I'm out here today is we have a table out there and we have petitions that you guys can sign to join us. Is Austin endorses us, and in fact, he and many others feel that Convention of States is the only way to save our country and prevent further tyranny and corruption. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin here. I don't want to waste too much of your time.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate it. Definitely give Convention of States a Google. It's a fascinating project, and I definitely personally endorse it. I think it's great. Also, I realized after all the hustle and bustle, I know a lot of you are here for Professor Banks' class for your extra credit. There's a sign-in sheet on the table that's separate from the sign-in sheet that I had you sign. That's for the event. So that one says Christopher Banks' extra credit sheet. Make sure you sign that on the way out, otherwise he won't give you your extra credit. So I want to make sure you get that for your attendance tonight. All right, so without further ado, I want to introduce Austin Petersen. So Austin Petersen was born in a place called Independence and raised on a horse farm in Peculiar, Missouri, near a town called Liberty. You could say fighting for liberty is his birthright. Austin graduated from Missouri State University with a degree in fine arts. After developing a career in media in both New York City and Washington, D.C., he returned to Kansas City, Missouri, the city he now calls home. In 2016, Austin appeared on the national stage as a candidate for President of the United States. He took second place in a crowded Libertarian primary behind Governor Gary Johnson and ahead of the eccentric cybersecurity expert John McAfee. During his campaign, Petersen earned many high-profile conservative endorsements and boasts the high praises of conservative powerhouses like Glenn Beck and Ben Shapiro. He is the owner and chief executive of Stonegate LLC, a political media consulting firm, and the founder of the Libertarian Republic, a powerful online news source that averages 1 million unique visits a month. And his podcast, The Freedom Report, receives an average of 1 million monthly downloads. He is the director of production he was the director of production at the famed Tea Party nonprofit FreedomWorks, and an associate producer for famed judge Andrew Napolitano's show Freedom Watch on Fox Business Network. Additionally, Petersen has a national following as a commentator and professional pundit, and appears frequently as a contributor on television, including Fox News, Fox Business, CNN, MSNBC, and many radio shows. So, without further ado, I give it up to our speaker for this evening, Austin Petersen. Thank you.
Nice to see you guys. Thanks so much for coming out. I want to talk about a little something that's relative to the geography of where we're at right now. But before we do, I kind of want to get a read on the audience and understand who we are and what you guys are all about. So my first question is, by show of hands or applause, how many of you are here because you want to make America great again? Okay. How many of you are here because you want to make taxation theft again? That's good. And how many of you think that taxes are the price we pay to live in a civilized society? Get out. Just kidding. All right, so we're going to talk about a lot tonight. I want to talk about free speech. I want to talk about free speech on college campuses. I want to talk a little bit about free speech in the real world, once you get out in the real world, what you might be dealing with, especially if you get involved in politics, by campaigning for office or by donating to causes that you believe in. And then I want to talk a little bit about recent history regarding the Tea Party, the MAGA movement, and where we might be going forward. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about Kent State. You know, guns are big in the news right now, and you guys have been a flashpoint. Obviously, on May the 4th, 1970, 4 students were killed, many others were injured by agents acting on behalf of the government here on your own campus. 4 people died. And Kevin was very kind. Thank you so much, Kevin, and to the Young Americans for Liberty for inviting me out here tonight, because I think that, to me, it is the perfect example of what happens when only one side, specifically the government, has the guns. But I don't have very many beautiful words to talk about their sacrifice, so I decided to cut and paste from a speech, very brief speech that our 16th president gave that I think applies very much to those 4 students and their sacrifice. So I just want to very briefly read this to you. In a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men and women, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what we did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we highly resolve these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And the reason I decided to read that to you is because it reminded me the sacrifice that those students made in opposing an illegal, an unconstitutional, undeclared war, the backlash that the loss of liberty would eventually come home. Many libertarian legal and economic and political philosophers believe that very thing, that when we have undeclared, unconstitutional, illegal, and immoral wars, that eventually those wars will come home. And we saw that happen on May the 4th, 1970, on this campus. But to me, it's not evidence that guns were the problem. It's evidence that government is the problem. And that's why I believe in the right to bear arms. And so I just want to say very much that I respect and honor the students who gave their lives in opposing an unconstitutional war on this campus. And thank you. And I hope that you will all continue to honor and live up to their legacy. So let's talk a little bit about free speech. That's a big issue right now. It didn't used to be. Only in the last 5 to 10 years has free speech become a flashpoint for some reason, because some people seem to think that we're losing free speech. Tonight we're going to talk about free speech in regards to social media. I've certainly been the victim of, you might call censorship, you might call it banning, blocking for my views, my intense political views on social media. We'll talk about that later. We're going to talk about the NFL. We're going to talk about the national anthem, taking a knee, and we're going to talk a little bit about safe spaces, and we're going to talk about why I think conservatives, specifically conservatives, and sometimes libertarians, are under attack. Now, before we can do that, we need to understand what free speech is, right? And the difference between private and public. But first of all, we need to understand where our rights come from. Because the question that I think most people want to ask is, where do our rights come from? Some might say our rights come from God, some may say our rights come from government. Now, my understanding is that we, as the highest order of nature, right, you might say nature is God, as humans, as individuals, our rights are innate because some truths are self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Some people believe that a creator God is what grants us our rights. And other people believe that our rights come from government. And I argue that the founding fathers, the people who established the Constitution of the United States, adhere more to the natural rights view, the creator God, the natural rights perspective. They did not believe that rights came from government, and here's why. The secrets, if you don't want to go back and read the constitutional debates, the secret lies in the First Amendment itself. In the First Amendment, the most important word in the First Amendment is the freedom of speech. Why is the most important word? Well, the is the most important word in the freedom of speech because it suggests that our rights predate the creation of the national government. The freedom of speech indicates that you, as an individual, have rights that government cannot take away. Meaning that if we, as perfectly formed humans, as a result of a creator God, or as the highest and best example of evolution's progress, we as individuals have rights that cannot be granted by government. They can be taken away, or they can be acknowledged by government. But you have certain unalienable individual rights, and they do not come from government. Now, on college campuses, your rights to free speech are under attack, and there are many examples of this going on in recent history and today. Now, at first, we started seeing the rise of safe spaces on college campuses, and they were meant, I think, with the best intentions, to give people a place to go and to vent their frustrations. But now, it's not about protecting you, it's about protecting you from dangerous ideas. That's why what happens to people like Ann Coulter when they want to try and speak on a college campus at Berkeley, they get shut down. If Milo Yiannopoulos wants to go and speak in Southern California, Antifa, Social Democrats, they'll show up and they'll burn and riot until he's canceled. Is that free speech? Now, we also have another example where Charles Murray, now some of you don't know who this is, but he's a conservative scholar. He was literally physically attacked while crossing campus at Middlebury College. And the reason why I think that this is happening is that I believe that because the left has lost the policy debate, the tactics now are resorted to shutting down the argument. If you cannot win the policy debate, then you have to resort to censorship. Now, on college campus, it's one thing, because we have a difference between a private university and a public university. Now, on Hillsdale College in Michigan, they don't take a dime of federal money. So if nobody were to protest, it wouldn't be a big deal. If somebody showed up and they did protest, well, it might be an issue, because if it's private dollars, the people who are paying to go there, the people who are paying for the endowments, those people are the ones who ultimately will make the decision. But at a public university that's taking public money and is being publicly funded, should the U.S. Constitution apply? And that's the heart of the question. Because I argue that in every debate that we have, what we're really discussing is the question of private property and public property. Now, in the outside world, once you get out of college and you want to engage in political activism, you're going to be in real severe danger. And I know this firsthand, not just from my experience on social media getting banned by Facebook, but in my experience in running as a political candidate. I have had violent threats. I have had people showing up to my events, trying to block me from speaking at events. I've had student governments, of which I got to see yours today, and I saw that you guys functioned very well. Congratulations. Even though I didn't agree with what was done today, but you know what? That's democracy. Sorry, Kevin. That's what it's like to be a liberal libertarian. You're always going to lose. It's like Gary Johnson. I'll go there later. But in the outside world, if you want to engage in activism, just consider this. If you'd like to start up a nonprofit, say this is 2010, 2012, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, was weaponized against conservatives. Now, you heard that I was working at FreedomWorks. Well, while I was working at FreedomWorks at the time, that institution would undergo 2 IRS audits a year, minimum. And if you had the name Tea Party in your group, or patriots or conservative or libertarian in the name of your nonprofit, they would hold up your applications. They would deny your applications. In essence, they were denying your free speech. While liberal institutions, liberal organizations were free to compete in the 2010 and 2012 elections. This is a direct attack on free speech, but it's not the most violent. Lois Lerner was weaponized by the President of the United States to shut down conservative institutions that might have impacted the fall elections. Now, in Milwaukee, many of you know Governor Scott Walker, right, in Wisconsin. Right, so in Milwaukee, Democratic prosecutors actually launched bogus criminal campaign finance investigations into 30 conservative groups that supported Scott Walker's reforms of public sector unions, and they conducted pre-dawn raids and issued gag orders. In one instance, cops actually raided a home where a teenage boy was alone, and they sequestered him in his home and refused to allow him to call his grandparents or a lawyer and threatened him if he told anyone. Frederick Bastiat is one of our great libertarian luminaries who wrote a book called The Law, which I highly recommend to all of you. But in the beginning of this book, he argues that when the law is perverted, the police powers of the state are perverted along with it. Sometimes I like to argue that if I were a government official, who knows if that could ever happen, I would say that we should make a law that every single law should end with, or we will kill you. Because is that not the logical end of every piece of legislation? Because what happens if you do not comply? Now, what were these people doing other than engaging in free speech? They were financing conservative groups that were supporting reforms of public sector unions. The cops raided their homes, took one of their teenage boys, locked him in the house, told him he couldn't leave, raided his house, took all of their files and their computers, and said if he told anyone, they would arrest him and take him to jail. Couldn't call a lawyer, couldn't call his grandparents. Or we will kill you. That's the end of every law on the books. Now, this kind of corruption goes all the way up to the highest levels of our government. Senator Dick Durbin sent thousands of letters to donors to ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is instrumental in pushing and crafting pro-gun legislation around the country. He threatened to haul them in front of Congress if people supported this group. All of their donors, of course, are public, as according to campaign finance laws. Half of their donors deserted overnight. This is a direct attack from the highest levels of our government on free speech. Now, in California, many of you guys remember Proposition 8? Right? This was the anti-gay marriage proposal. And I just want to preface this by saying I totally believe in a world where gay married couples can defend their marijuana fields with fully automatic machine guns.
Yeah.
Okay? But that's too much freedom for most people in this country right now. Freedom is dangerous as hell. But I prefer it to the alternative. Right? Thank you. Yeah. But in California, left-wing activists targeted donors to Proposition 8 because these people supported a ban on gay marriage. I disagreed with Governor Mitt Romney on this issue. I disagreed with my fellow Republican friends and many of my conservative friends. But they have the right to engage in free speech. Now, the donors' addresses, the people who donated to Proposition 8, had their addresses put on a map online. So what happens? Their houses get broken into, their cars get keyed, there were flash mobs that showed up to their businesses, and these attacks were very successful because the targets stopped donating to these causes. Does anybody remember the CEO, Mozilla Firefox? So he was outed as a donor to this cause. He was fired. How far are we going to take it? Of course, most of us would agree that you have free speech, but you're not free from the consequences of your speech, right? So every action, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But should we have privacy when it comes to the donations that we make to political campaigns? Right? And if so, how much? Right now, if you want to contribute to a federal campaign, you can give $2,700. But once you give $200, Your name and your address, your personal information, will be published on a website for the world to see. Which is why so many people, especially my paranoid libertarian friends, only give me $199. But these campaign finance laws are written by incumbents to protect incumbents. And of course, we all are familiar with Citizens United. Citizens United was allowed the creation of super PACs. Is anybody here not familiar with super PACs? Okay, it's okay. I'll give you a brief overview if not. All right. So the question is, how much of my money am I allowed to expend in favor of defending a cause that I believe in? For example, there's a doctor in Louisiana right now. He's an addiction specialist. His name's Dr. Howard Wetzman. He's dealt with people with opioid addictions, all sorts of drug addictions. He wants to end the federal war on drugs, and so do I. But if he wants to give to the causes that I'm working on, he's only allowed to give $2,700. So these kinds of election laws that are meant to prevent the rich people from buying our elections are actually having the opposite effect. It's stopping grassroots candidates. It's stopping people like yourself when you don't have billions and billions of dollars, but maybe you've got a father who can help fund your campaigns, or your nonprofits, or your political activism. All of these kind of rules do is clamp down on your ability to exercise your free speech. Now, in 1958, there was a case in Alabama where the NAACP was suing the state of Alabama, and the Supreme Court ruled against their Attorney General, right? And he was demanding a list of their names, of members, right? This is before the Civil Rights Act had passed, right? In the 1950s, when blacks were afraid of being lynched, they couldn't sit at lunch counters. Jim Crow was rampant across the South. The Attorney General of Alabama was demanding a list of the members of the NAACP, right? Now, most of us today would say, oh, of course, yes. Oh, if you're going to donate to John McCain, or if you're going to donate to these politicians who I hate, well, then of course you should have to list their names. But in this case, the Attorney General wanted a list of those names so that they could be persecuted. Now, we're very lucky because the court found that revealing their identities would make them the target of race-related violence. And so they found in favor of free speech. So the question there is, where's the line? Should we have some level of anonymity in engaging in the type of political activism that we have? You say yes. You'll ask yourself this. When an Antifa protesters show up in Berkeley, in California, they're wearing masks. Many of them are wearing masks. So a local ordinance was passed that banned the use of masks at protests. I'm sure that there were probably many protesters here in 1970 who chose to wear bandanas or scarves over their face. Do they have the right of anonymity? So there's a conflict with free speech, and it affects all levels, from our universities, our institutions, to our institutions of government, to the public square, and even in the private square. Because I would like to talk to you now about Charlottesville. Everybody remember the Tiki Torch losers? Jews will not replace us. And Christopher Cantwell, that idiot. The crying Nazi. One of the greatest moments of my life was watching that. But do they have the right? Do Nazis have the right to free speech? Yeah, they do. You have the right to be a total idiot in this country, in public, and I have the right to counteract you. Ron Paul once said that we don't have free speech so that we can talk about the weather. We have free speech so that we can talk about very dangerous things. That's why we're talking about Nazis right now. Now, do you have a right to punch a Nazi? No. Just like you don't have the right to throw communists out of helicopters. You have the right to be a dirty, stinking commie in this country without going all Pinochet on their butts. That's what America's all about. So no, you don't have the right to punch a Nazi for engaging in nothing more than free speech. So let's talk about the statutes for a moment. Because here we have all these dichotomies, and we have all of these strange, metaphorical questions we have to ask ourselves. Because if someone in Seattle was going to tear down the statue of Lenin, you know what I'd do? Cheer. I would love every second of it. I would love nothing more than to see every single statue to every single communist dictator being brought to the ground and beheaded and taken through the town square. Communism killed 50 million people, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. Thanks, Gary. I hate comics. And then, of course, we have the question of these statues in Charlotte. Well, I don't hold the Confederacy in high regard, and I can sympathize and I can empathize with many of our friends and neighbors here in this country who would be offended that in a public square, public taxpayer dollars are being used to maintain monuments to the legacy of slavery, of racism and hatred and Jim Crow in this country. I totally understand that. I totally empathize with that. But then, of course, I ask the question, well, then what about the monuments to Confederates on Gettysburg property? Should those be taken down too? We have to ask ourselves these questions. Right? But the answer lies in a solution that very few people will defend. Maybe my ANCAP friends over here. Anarcho-capitalists, for the layman. Yeah, privatize everything, right? Of course. So what happened to the park where the head of the KKK, the man who started the KKK, Nathan Bedford Forrest Gump was named after him, Nathan Bedford Forrest's park, Memorial Park, where he's buried, where the statue is, was sold at private auction. Private property, so now they can get rid of the statue. Well, many of the rebels didn't like it because they thought it was disrespectful to the Confederate general. And many of the liberals didn't like it because you took a public park and you privatized it. But the true libertarians believe that this is the right thing to do, because my taxpayer dollars ultimately should not be forced to pay for your symbols of slavery or racism. And let's not forget, too, of course, that the American flag flew over a slave nation for far longer than the rebel flag. Dangerous ideas. We're not talking about the weather here. We're talking about free speech. But free speech on private property is one thing, and free speech on public property is another. Do you have free speech to go into somebody else's private property or their yard and carry a sidearm and say all kinds of stupid racist stuff? No, get off my lawn, get my shotgun out and Clint Eastwood your ass. Get out of here. This is my private property. What about your places of business? Are they private property? No. That's why Gary Johnson says that you should have to bake the damn cake. Because your business is not private property. Because of the legacy of civil rights in this country, because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, your business is now considered public, open to the public, which is why we now have a question before the Supreme Court of whether the Christian cake baker should be required through government force, or we will kill you, bake the damn cake. So, of course, Governor Johnson and I were in a bit of a dust-up. We were having a debate during the presidential election cycle. Governor Johnson was asked, should the Christian be forced to bake the wedding cake? And he says, yes, absolutely, the Christian should be forced to bake the cake for the gay wedding. I believe in gay marriage, but I don't believe in forcing Christians to bake wedding cakes for gay couples if it goes against their freedom of conscience. So I asked the governor, Governor, should a Jewish baker be forced to bake a cake for a Nazi wedding? And he said yes. Of course, technically, according to the law, National Socialism is not a protected class. But I think the governor had had too many Chila chews that night. And he was feeling a little lightheaded. But technically, under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we have this thing called protected classes. And the question is, how many more people are we going to add to the protected class list? How many more people? Well, as of right now, in the United States, the only people who are not a protected class are white males aged 40 years old and younger. I'm 37 now, so in 3 more years, I will be protected, children. Should we expand the definition of protected classes? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the African American will be forced to make the clanhood. And that's the question at odds. When Governor Johnson was in West Virginia after this debate, where I totally destroyed him, an African American gentleman got up and said, I make clothing, I make shirts, and I make robes for the local church. Would you force me to make a Klan robe? Right? So that's the question. Do we ultimately respect private property in this country, or do we not? How much farther are we willing to take the question of protected classes, right, to every single gender that will be created in the next 7 to 10 years, until finally people say, okay, we need to get back to the concept of private property or public property. It's possible to hate racists, it's possible to hate bigots and xenophobes and homophobes, and I do. Trust me, I really frickin' do. Tear down this wall, I say. But still believe that those idiots have free speech. You're not brave when you defend the rights of somebody that agrees with you. You're not. You're brave when you defend the rights of somebody that you disagree with. Thank you. I disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And that is liberty. That is freedom. That's what America was founded on. Do we have free speech on social media? Anybody?
No.
This is the only college to say no. Thank you. The smartest, brightest, best are at Kent State. Seriously. I ask that question everywhere I go. I say, do you have free speech on social media? They're like, yup. I'm like, no, of course not. As I well know. So I got banned from Facebook twice for doing something that every good conservative would do, giving away a free AR-15. I also did get like a little strike on the wrist too, because I posted something. I said, well, President Obama once famously said that weapons of war don't belong in our streets. So I said, you're right, Mr. President, weapons of war don't belong in our streets. They belong in your hands, so register with the And for that, I was banned from Facebook. So the interesting thing about this, of course, now, and this is something that we're going to have to face, conservatives are very much under attack from Facebook, from Twitter, from YouTube, Google, under all auspices. Every single platform that exists, every major platform right now, is taking steps to limit the conservative viewpoint about the role of government, about the Second Amendment, about free speech. These are private companies. Right? These are liberal companies, mostly liberal, majority owned. Mark Zuckerberg, major donor to Democrats, big fan of President Obama. Facebook, their chief operating officer, Sheryl Sandberg, is contributing the maximum amount to Democrat Claire McCaskill for her election campaigns. Now, isn't that interesting? So the first time that the ban happened to me, we caused a sting. All I did was do a video about how Claire McCaskill had voted against our gun rights. Oh, and by the way, I'm giving away free AR-15. And that video was deleted. I was banned for 30 days. No warning, no strike. I hadn't been banned before. Maybe like a 24-hour thing or something like that for posting a really spicy meme. But I mean, if you haven't got banned from Facebook for 24 hours for a spicy meme, then you're not living. But after we posted the fact that their chief operating officer appeared to be colluding, and we said, hey, we hear that you're really worried about Russians interfering in our elections. Would you mind not interfering with this election, by the way? And they called us up and said, oh, our mistake, this was an algorithm. Computer error. Because, we had the AR-15, we had the rifle in the video. So the second time, I drew a picture of me. Because they said it was okay. Not a violation of terms of service. Hundreds of gun giveaways are done on Facebook every single day. There are pages devoted solely to giving away rifles, firearms, firearm accessories, right? And then, of course, there's the National Association for Gun Rights and the NRA, and they're giving away like massive weaponry and stuff. You know, and by the way, you know, I do get upset when people say they'll call my weapons like military grade, because my weapons are way better than military grade. I got that from a meme. I just gotta throw it in. So it was very interesting because you see people like Steven Crowder, you see people like Dennis Prager, right, involved in lawsuits with YouTube because of their inability to spread their ideas on YouTube. So the funny thing is, of course, conservatives believe in private property. Liberals mostly don't when it comes to businesses. So should Facebook be forced to take the gun? If you know what I'm saying? Should they be?
No.
No, they shouldn't. But the consequences of the best intended legislation that was meant to advance civil rights, that was absolutely necessary in the context of the time in which it was passed, has unintended consequences in subsequent generations. And we see what that is. Because now every Christian will be forced to bake the cake. Every Jew will be forced to bake the Nazi cake. And Facebook and YouTube and Google may be taken over. Which is amazing, of course, because then, you know, the same thing happens where we're arguing, we conservatives and libertarians are arguing strenuously against net neutrality. And yet the Democrats want net neutrality so badly. And I wonder, what are they thinking? Because how many Supreme Court justices is Trump going to appoint? Possibly 4 in his lifetime? You do realize, liberals, that when you call for regulation of things like the internet, it is we conservatives and libertarians who will be controlling government for the next 30 to 50 years. We will be writing the rules. This administration will be putting 3 to 4 Supreme Court picks in. So be very careful, Democrats, when you call for regulation, because it will be my friends who will be writing regulations. Think about it. Think before you act. NFL, stand for the anthem. Stand for the pledge. Stand for the pledge. Stand for our national anthem. Those soldiers, they died for my right to force you to stand. Wait a minute. Is that right? No, that's not right, is it? It doesn't seem right. So do the NFL players have a right to take a knee?
Yes.
Damn right. Can they be fired for it?
Yes.
They can. Because it's private property. Now, I know a lot of you pedantic libertarians are going to talk about how we fund stadiums with taxpayer dollars. Just stop being so damn pedantic for 1 minute. Yes, we do, okay? So maybe the Constitution should apply in the stadium, right? And they can take a knee. No, it's a private business, private team. You have a right to free speech, but you don't have a right to be free of the consequences of your speech. And that's really what we should conclude. I'll say you're not a patriot just because you stand for the pledge or the national anthem, and you're not a hero because you take a knee. You're a patriot when you get off your damn knees, grab a flintlock, and kill some mother effing redcoats. Thank you very much. That concludes the first part of my talk. I just want to very briefly talk about, which was kind of the marquee, what this event was sold as, because I don't have any notes for this, because it's just something that I've been talking about with Glenn Beck and Ben Shapiro. I highly recommend you all go back and Google the recent interviews that I've done, specifically with Ben Shapiro and Glenn Beck, about a conservative and libertarian alliance. So in 2008, that's when I began my political maneuvering. I was campaigning for Ron Paul. I was living in New York City, and we took a 12-person group and turned it into a 1,200-person strong organization in 3 months and raised $1 million for Ron Paul. That's how I got into politics. Well, in 2010, we were having tea parties in New York City and DC and stuff like that. They were grassroots. All of a sudden, President Obama gets elected, and it's like the tea party was on. And it was the Tea Party was centered around three major ideas, right? It was very policy focused, actually, in the beginning. People talked about populism, you know, blah, 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 these general concepts. But in the beginning, T stood for taxed enough already. So T was about not having higher taxes, right? The Tea Party wanted to cut taxes. It was opposed to taxes, Obamacare, and stimulus. Now, the reason why I argued that the Tea Party was so successful is because it was centered around three policy goals that a broad coalition of people could get behind. Taxed enough already, absolutely. Conservatives, libertarians, we were jiving, we were rolling. And I do remember being out on the steps of the Capitol lawn, being surrounded by conservatives. Of course, we libertarians with our no step on snake shirts and taxation theft hats, we were like the minority, right? But we were doing what we could. We were building coalitions, right? We were very excited. People like Rand Paul were getting elected. Justin Amash, Thomas Massey, right? Ted Cruz was going to get in there, right? And we were excited because we were able to build a broad-based coalition focused around these policy ideals. Then, I remember, in 2012, when the tone of the rallies changed from taxes, stimulus, and Obamacare to immigration. And that's when I was like, oh shit, we're losing focus, and we're going to lose this movement. And sure enough, 2012 goes by, 2014 comes in, right? We get to 2015, right around 2015, when the Tea Party, which was a broad-based coalition, suddenly became narrowly focused around one major concept: build that wall, which was a departure from the Tea Party and a departure from the Reagan years. Of course, Ronald Reagan was for open borders. Suck it, I said it, Republicans. That's what Ronald Reagan was for, literally, right? Not what I'm saying I'm arguing for, I'm just saying that that's what the Republican Party was for. Free trade, free immigration. That was the Republican Party. That changed. Now we have a populist movement, the Make America Great Again movement, right? We have what the MAGA movement is a populist movement, which populism, broadly defined, is anti-elitism. That's what populism is. And it's a double-edged sword. Because just because an elite has an idea doesn't mean the idea is bad, right? For the most part, I'm pretty anti-elitist, right? Farm boy, born a peculiar, right? To hell with Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the elites. You know, to hell with all of them. Because they don't give a damn about you. I spent enough time in Washington, D.C. and New York to hear these people in the green rooms at Fox News talking about Missouri and the Midwestern states, people at places like Ohio as flyover country, to know that they don't give a damn about us. The Beltway elite, these mother effers, do not care about us. They don't care. And you know what? The long history of the United States has been a struggle between the industrialists of the North and the agrarians of the South, and it's still going on today. MAGA, Make America Great Again, was the agrarian revolt. It was the blue-collar revolt. The populists, the anti-elitists, had had enough of being lectured to by think tanks and policy wonks and preening politicians like Paul Ryan and others, you know, telling us that they know what's best for us. And even if they were right, we didn't care because we're sick and tired of being talked down to and lectured to by people who think there are betters and who take our money. Their salaries come from taxpayer dollars, which leads me to the question, why do government officials even pay taxes? Like, what is the point of that? But the MAGA movement is a revolt against the elite, and Donald Trump was willing to, Donald Trump was not a guy saying, I'm going to take a rock and I'm going to throw it in through the window. Donald Trump is the guy from the top of Trump Tower who's throwing bricks inside the building. Because, don't argue that Donald Trump wasn't an elite. He is. He always was an elite. But Donald Trump said to us, to the conservatives, and to many libertarians who support him, he said, I will destroy your enemies. And that's what we wanted. It is. I didn't want Hillary Clinton to be president. Of course, I tried to be president, so. I still think I could have done a better job. Can't say that. Even though it's going to get out there, and I'm going to get so many angry MAGA people at me tonight, but I'm trying to help the MAGA movement now, even though I don't agree with them on many things. I've never backed down on the policies that I believe in, even though I've changed parties. because my people told me to. I've always been pro-life, pro-liberty, pro-constitution, but the MAGA movement is in danger now because the way that the Tea Party was destroyed was that the establishment came in and they co-opted us. They co-opted us with all these fake institutions, these fake nonprofits, and it's happening again. Establishment Republicans are running as MAGA Republicans. And they don't believe what the MAGA people believe. They're just lying to all of their constituents, saying that they believe these things so that they can get elected and get power. And yet politicians who run for office, who are not willing to lie, take the hit. I cannot tell you how many times when I ran for office as a libertarian, I had to tell someone I would not be a good candidate for you. How many times do you think a politician does that? At least the ones who get elected. And that's the problem. We tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies. We love Bernie Sanders because he lies to us. He lies. He tells us that we can have everything for free. It's a lie. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. But the politicians who lie to us the most are the ones that we love the most. And that's why we have the state of the United States as it is. I don't know how to fix this, but I can tell you that if we want to fix it, the way forward from where we are right now is a libertarian and conservative alliance. I am calling for a grand libertarian and conservative alliance. And for that to happen, as Ben Shapiro has said, as Glenn Beck has said, as I am saying, libertarians and conservatives will need to accept the libertarian view on government. And libertarians need to accept the conservative view of institutions, families, friends, neighbors, churches. These institutions will be needed if we have a smaller government to solve society's ills. If we have a smaller government, drug addiction will still exist. If we end the war on drugs, people are still going to be addicted to these dangerous substances. If prostitution was legal, it would still be a very dangerous, desperate thing for a woman to do. There will still be institutions that will be necessary to help these women and men who are abused. So that is what I think needs to happen. Conservatives must accept the libertarian view on government. No longer can you take your narrow view of morality that is handed to you from whatever sect that your parents handed to you and say that the government must enforce this narrow sectarian view of morality. It must be that conservatives finally lock hands with libertarians and say, conservatives, limited government, libertarians, families, friends, neighbors, and churches. There are so many angry libertarian atheists and anti-institutionalists who want to tear down the pillars, who don't know that before we had government, it was the churches who did most of the charity. I say this as someone who is not religious, that I believe religion can be a powerful force for good. And if we have a smaller government, we are going to need our conservative friends in order to accomplish the goals of society. Less poverty, less violence, less welfare. That's what I propose. And I think that that's the only productive way forward. A truly principled, libertarian, conservative alliance for the future. Thank you. I'll be happy to take your questions.
All right, everyone. So we're going to go into Q&A for probably about, about 30 minutes or so?
Yeah.
That'll be perfect. And then we'll try to, how many people want to get pictures, shake hands with Austin? All right, cool. I knew that was gonna be bad. All right, so what we'll do is I'm gonna walk around, do some questions.
I'm just gonna plug this in real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put Austin in the middle, and then we'll do like a line and run you guys through, so it's not a big gaggle when he's trying to like get out of here. So, and we'll try to run everybody as fast as we can, so you can get out and cry over homework later like myself. So. All right, so let's do, I'll start over here and work my way over. Try to be concise with your questions, like no multi-parts, just be considerate of his time and everybody else's time, and there's going to be lots of questions. Anybody on this side of the room want to ask him anything?
Mr. Petersen, you obviously ran for president in 2016 for the Libertarian Party, and now you're running for Senate against Josh Hawley to contend against Claire McCaskill. You definitely seem to be very enthusiastic about what you're doing right now. If you happen to either not get the nomination or lose the general election, would you look to run again?
The revolution continues, my friend. Whether it's through political campaigns, through street activism, if I have to go back to pounding the pavement, handing out pamphlets for my favorite libertarian candidate or Republican or nonprofit, I will always be there because the fight for liberty, liberty's a long way off. I think there are too many people now who are counting on me to stay in the fight. So I'll be there, no matter what.
Thank you.
As I get to your section, just kind of raise your hand or flag me down. It'll make the whole process a little bit faster. Following on to that.
All right. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the recent conviction of Marcus Meacham, also known as Count Dankula, in Scotland.
The Nazi pug.
Yes.
What? I mean, obviously it's ridiculous, but I think it's amazing that the United States has gotten our traditions of American liberty came from the traditions of English liberty, right? John Locke, right, and The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith. So, but I mean, the problem is always and always has been that Britain only ever had a very brief experiment with true parliamentary democracy during the time of Oliver Cromwell. And then, of course, the monarchy came back in. And so as I was saying earlier, the concept of where rights comes from to the British, in the British system, has been, it comes from government, right? They acknowledge the concept of a creator God, right, and of a higher power, something higher than government. But still, their concept of rights is that, what the government says you have is a right. So that's called positivism, right? And unfortunately, natural rights, or the negative concept of liberty, we're the last stand for freedom here in the United States. So it doesn't surprise me to see Britain do things like that. I expect them to become more tyrannical and authoritarian, very V for Vendetta type of a government, very George Orwell, 1984, because their legal system and precedent has situated themselves to do so. And that's why we have to fight to maintain the conception of negative rights here in the United States. I could talk about that for hours, but yeah, don't throw something in jail because they made their pub go say hi, right? Obviously, it's ridiculous. And many people agree. Ricky Gervais has been tweeting about it. Yes.
Okay, so it seems like nowadays in politics, everything is about what Gargamel can we point to for us to say, okay, well, if you support them, then you support this. Whether it's like, okay, well, you're going to have the refugees coming in, or all the immigrants, right? Yeah, or on the left, it's like you're going to have Nazis marching down the street. Right. Is politics gone beyond reason in today's America that we can't actually return there?
Well, think of it like this. I mean, during the American Revolution, only about a third of the colonists actually supported the revolution. A third of them didn't care, and a third of them actively worked against it with the Tories. So only a small group of people have ever defended true liberty, and that's always how it was. I mean, I can't remember the quote, but I mean, it does not take a majority to succeed, but an irate minority keen to light the brush fires of freedom in the minds of men, right? Sure. And the thing that I've learned the most from politics, and Kevin and I were talking about it earlier today with his experience with student government, is that facts and reason and logic don't sell. Libertarians have too many engineers and not enough salesmen. That's the problem. And we hate salesmen.
Right.
And we destroy them, and we kill them, and we put them in second place for libertarian primaries. Because those seem like the kids who picked on us in class, right? Right? I was a nerd too, but the problem is that, you know, I think Thomas Paine once said that using reason on those who have renounced it is like trying to administer medicine to the dead, right? So for example, when I campaign now, I don't go out there and make the best policy arguments, because the person with the best policy arguments doesn't win. They get Ron Paul, you know, they get sidelined. It's a person who, they won't remember what you say, but they will remember how you made them feel.
Right.
And that's we don't like that as libertarians, because we're like, I want to read the book, you know, Theories of Economics and Economics in One Lesson. If you tell somebody to read economics in one lesson, that's an insult, you know? So empathize, right? Sympathize, find a way to get in there. Be their friend first. Find something you agree with them on first, then you're their friend, and then you can go and have a pint of Yingling on the back porch and disagree about things all the time. And you can, because you have Yingling here, you SOBs. We don't have that in Missouri. It's a wonderful beer, and you're all very lucky. Yes, sir.
The problem I see with politics in this country is that the politicians only talk to their base. How do you reach out to people who don't already agree with you?
How do I personally, or how would anyone? Well, I actually go to Black Lives Matter rallies. I've been to Bernie Sanders rallies, and I show up to those rallies so that I can talk with them, engage with them. I was at a Democratic Socialist rally in St. Louis recently, it was like 6 months ago, and somebody showed up, and this guy, he's like carrying the socialist flag. And he goes, Austin Petersen! He's like, I would have voted for you. And I'm like, ooh. Well, why? And he goes, yes, I'm a Democratic Socialist, and I'm basically a communist. He goes, but I'm a Catholic, which means I'm pro-life, so you were the only pro-life libertarian, and I like your way better than Gary Johnson. He was kind of crazy. And you'll never know what it is that's going to make someone like you and connect with you and want to vote for you. George W. Bush won because people wanted to have a beer with him, right? Unfortunately, some of these answers are ultimately unsatisfying because it doesn't play to what we really want, which is some core truth. Right? We're always desperately seeking like the chalice, the holy grail, right? But the problem is that the truth is frequently so boring compared to the conspiracy theory, right? This is why the lie goes around the world twice before the truth has time to get on its shoes. The simple answer of politics for you, if you want to connect with someone, is you've got to be the guy that they want to have a beer with. You know, the one that hangs out with them after church, right? Is there with them and their family. The spreading of ideas is a social skill. Politics is a social skill. It's not economics, right? It's not even debate, right? As a matter of fact, some science has shown that the more you debate with someone, the more they dig in. Like, there's a part of the brain that when you're arguing with someone, it's the same part of the brain that lights up that feels like they're being physically attacked, which makes them feel fight or flight, which makes them even more grounded in their positions. First thing that you want to do, if you want to help change hearts and minds, is you have to empathize. You have to find that idea, that one spark, that one thing that you agree with them on, and make friends over that idea. And then you can disagree all day long about everything else, right? That's what it is. It's not a sexy answer. It's a fairly simple answer. And for some reason, libertarians tend to eschew it. To our detriment. And to our country's detriment. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Okay, I always look the other way, but okay, so obviously I have anti-intellectual property rights people on one side of me back here, and then I also have friends who are artists who support intellectual property. So what are your opinions? Do you believe in intellectual property or not?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, the thing is that Mickey Mouse should not have an infinite property, you know, copyright forever, right? He gets a special exception like for 100 years every time, which is ridiculous. But if I create a film, right, and if I invest $1 million into a film, essentially I should be able to create a contract with anyone who wishes to view my film, like at the beginning of a movie, right? It should say that little contract right there. If you choose to view this, then you agree not to copy or distribute those copies, right, so that we can create a licensing agreement. You know, sometimes I think, unfortunately, what happens is that crony capitalism steps in, many of these major corporations and some of these pharmaceutical companies, and they will create these egregious trademarks and copyrights and patents for these drugs that stop us from being able to duplicate life-saving drugs, right? So if anything, things like that, you're going to have to judge these on a case-by-case measure, right? So if it's drugs, you should have maybe 5 to 10 years to get a product to market. If not, if it's some scientific discovery to cure cancer, well, I'm sorry. You know, like, frankly, the public need for that outweighs the individual's good on something that's going to change humanity forever. So I don't think that there's one single answer for this, and it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But if it's film, you know what I mean? Like, that's a completely different thing, right? There's no inherent public interest in copying films, but, you know, maybe 10 to 20 years or something like that would be reasonable. But with drugs, it's a completely different question to answer.
In the West, as we see the radical left increasingly radicalizing and the right increasingly radicalizing in Europe, how can we have this conservative and libertarian alliance? How can we extend the olive branch to the people on the left that are disenfranchised? Because right now, I only see like the intellectuals, like Brett Weinstein and Gad Saad, who are evolutionary psychologists. That I only see the intellectuals right now on the left that are going against the social justice movement.
It's a really good question, and I think tribalism infects both sides. I think that what we're seeing right now with the radicalization of left and right is a question of radicalism. So if you're asking me from a tactical question, like how would you infiltrate a tribe, you have to pass a sniff test, right? Identifying what the sniff test is in order to be seen as a member of a tribe is really the question, right? So like Christianity could be viewed as a tribe, right? Whereas passing the sniff test would be accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, right? I mean, it is something you can fake, but it isn't something you really want to fake, right? But there are still ways to be a part. You can still go to church, right? You can still go and you can and commune with believers of a certain Christian church, and I would highly recommend you do that if you want to bring conservatives along to your ideas and your principles. But where does the left hang out, right? I mean, that's a tougher question, right? Because the institutions of the left tend to be the only institutions going to be those intellectual institutions, right? Brookings and things like that. And when it comes to like the youth, like what institutions of the youth hang out, you're not going to want to have a political conversation with somebody when you're high on ecstasy at a rave, right? So it's completely different. It's a completely different experience or atmosphere. In order for you to pass a sniff test for that tribe, I'm not suggesting do drugs. I'm just saying that you're going to have to find a way to put yourself into those situations so that you can pass a sniff test if you really want to infiltrate, because that's really what it is. Getting people out of their tribal politics and into like more intellectual, the halls of intellectual conversation is going to be a step-by-step, person-by-person endeavor. And it's something that I've been doing for years. Not necessarily always that successfully. Very difficult.
So I'm actually a chapter president for Americans for Liberty as well, and I'm aware that a lot of time you have all these like socialist groups and things like that on campus, and they're really the arm of a lot of these institutions you're talking about on campuses. You're talking about like Bernie Sanders campaigns and stuff like that. And so as a member of, I guess technically we're a younger generation than you according to the Pew research and stuff like that. So as a member of a younger wave of libertarians, what do you think is the best way to reach out to those people and not debate with them, as you pointed out?
Yeah.
Where would be the entry points, so to speak?
So the unfortunate thing is like the policy agreements that we would have with the left, it's difficult, right? So you're talking like maybe civil liberties, privacy. Here's a perfect example. Okay, so when I'm talking about gun rights, right? When I'm talking about freedom, why is it that after a tragedy happens that I'm not advocating for people to take away people's guns, right? There's bodies piling up. 17 people killed in Florida. Why, Austin, will you not give in to gun control measures? And I say, it's because there is no tragedy, no matter how great, that justifies taking away the rights of innocent people. Okay? Now, when I say that argument as it pertains to gun rights, the liberals are like, no, this is not true, right? But when I say, on 9/11, we were attacked by terrorists, and as soon as that day was over, Dick Cheney and the neoconservative establishment took legislation that they had been preparing for years, like the Patriot Act, and rammed it through Congress. So now we have unconstitutional, warrantless surveillance of American citizens. We've lost our Fourth Amendment rights. There is no tragedy, no matter how great, that justifies taking away the rights of innocent people. So this moral maxim applies from the Fourth Amendment to the Second Amendment. So trying to find that kind of universal principle where we can find agreement as free humans who believe, in some general concept of liberty or freedom, I think you're going to have to find that base, right? I mean, if they just don't believe in private property, or they believe in, collectivism extreme, right, where this, all is the state, nothing outside the state, right? I am the state, essentially. Then you're going to have a harder time. But if they do believe in limited government in certain things, right? Some liberals believe in limited government in regards to the war on drugs, right? Some of them believe in limited government as regards to, immigration, right? So perhaps, finding those simple precepts or maxims that apply universally, you can then take and apply to other things that they might be iffy on, like the Second Amendment. Right? Not an easy question, but a good one.
Austin, you mentioned you were pro-life.
Yes, sir.
I know a lot of libertarians are kind of split on that. How do you justify it with your libertarianism?
Sure, good question. Actually, I think I said before I was always pro-life. I wasn't always pro-life. As a matter of fact, I think it was like 6 years ago. It was when I came into contact with Judge Napolitano, and I was reading about this Catholic theory, the consistent pro-life ethic, that it made me change my mind, and I realized how inconsistent I was being when I said I believed in liberty, because without life, there is no liberty. And so without life, there's no liberty. So then the question is the unborn a human? I think it is. If scientists were to find a cluster of cells on Mars, what would they call that? So then why doesn't that apply to the unborn woman? And if that is a human, and if that's a life, do all humans deserve the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? So, on first blush, it's a question of intellectual consistency. And then when I realized, when I was having conversations with liberals who were pro-choice, I realized that they had almost a disdain for human life. Like their arguments border on the eugenic, that some life is more valuable than others. That we want to pass bills that make it okay to kill a mentally retarded child, potentially mentally retarded child. Is that okay? That's eugenics. So then is it okay to kill a child if it's going to be a girl? That's eugenics. As a matter of fact, that's what they do in China because of their one-child policy. That's eugenics. So I don't want to be involved with a movement that does not have the same respect for life, because then they have no respect for liberty. Life is the cornerstone of liberty. These are not religious arguments. These are arguments based on a positive view of humanity. I want to see humans populate this planet, populate other planets. I want to see us go to the stars. I want to see science take us into the galaxy. But a humanity, a civilization that looks at human life with disdain as if it's disposable, that's never going to get there. I think science will eventually move the viability back further and further. I think birth control will become more easily attainable. I think sex education will get better with the proliferation of the internet. I think contraceptives will be sold eventually over-the-counter. Birth control pills will be sold over-the-counter rather than through a doctor's prescription, much to the chagrin of many of my conservative friends. And I think that we should respect life, and we should protect life, and we should never look at abortion as birth control. That's not what it should be. So I'm pro-life for that reason and many others. Don't kill the babies.
Hey, I just wanted to say, first of all, in 16 I was going to vote for you, but then you dropped out, and obviously it was 2016, so my only two choices were Donald Trump and Harambe. And I bet you can guess who I voted for. It was Harambe.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, what do you believe the government's responsibility is toward funding space exploration?
I would actually say that government's role in space exploration should be limited to those items required for national defense. Specifically for us to have the capability to strike down nuclear weapons, right? People laughed at the Space Force, but I mean, the only thing that was laughable is that they said that the Air Force was going to do it, but there's no air in space, so the Navy. It's true, come on. The Navy would control the ships in space, and then the Marines would be on the ships, and we'd have Space Marines. Right, because there's no air in space, so it's the Navy that controls them. Come on, Mr. President. So I promise next year, tell Mr. President that it's the Navy and the Marines in space. For national defense purposes, for exploration, really we need to stay out of it. You know, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'm sure they all mean well, but government is a poor tool for anything. And even I think a lot of national defense items could come from private space exploration. Who knows what Elon Musk could discover, right? And if he wants to go to Mars, let him, right? I know a lot of people I'd love to send to Mars. They want to go there voluntarily. Yeah, I really think that it's time for government to get out of the way, and it's time for the private market to get in front and start sending more people to space. And I would love to see us, go to Mars. It may not be practical. One of the biggest, actually, talking about policies, one of the biggest things that's in our way to really unleash the private marketplace, this is kind of a dangerous topic, is that we signed a lot of nuclear treaties in the 1970s. So if planet Earth was going to be destroyed like a year from now, let's say a neutron star was headed towards planet Earth and we were going to die in heat death a year from now, there's probably only one method of space transportation that we could use in order for us to get the hell off the planet and possibly head to the next, Goldilocks zone planet, right? And that would be a nuclear bomb set off behind a space capsule that would then project it into space, because of course solar and other forms of fossil fuels create a chicken and egg problem. So we do need to actually deregulate some nuclear testing in order for the private market to step in so that we can actually have functional space travel. Because right now, solar's not going to do it. Fuel isn't going to do it, right? Because it takes too much energy to get off the planet. So right now, if we want to have something that could potentially, be our plan B, then we're going to have to deregulate our nuclear testing, which scares a lot of people, but frankly, I think it needs to be done.
All right, so this is a little bit of a two-parter. I'll keep it short. Okay, what is your take on global warming? And assuming it is as NASA says, are there any non-authoritarian solutions to it?
So it's a good question. Problem is that the liberals don't call it global warming anymore. They call it climate change, right? So it's not global warming. Global warming is what they used to call it, because then once they realized that the globe wasn't really warming and that sometimes it would actually be cooler, then we have to say climate change, because climate change is everything, right? Always. So we got to broaden the terms so that we can regulate, right? The problem, of course, with if we're going to look at this in terms of extremes, right, is that you don't have the right to pollute somebody else's private property, right? I don't have the right to dump toxic chemicals into your lawn or into your river and pollute and poison you, right? If I did something like that, you would have the right to be angry, right? So the question is, how much prior restraint does the government need to engage in, right? Probably one of the most reasonable forms of prior restraint that the government reins us in on is carburetors, right? So, a strict definition of the non-aggression principle, according to anarchists, capitalists, is that if you step onto my lawn, if you're a Girl Scout cookie and you step onto my lawn, I can put a claymore mine on it and blow you up. Because it's my private property and I can shoot you if you walk on my property. Right? Perfect private property. The problem with that, of course, is that, Little Girl Scouts are going to get blown up by landmines, right? So that's a problem. So the question is, how much prior restraint, right, can be issued in order to stop you from engaging in behavior that might harm someone else? Of course, secondhand smoke. Can we ban smoking because secondhand smoke might get in somebody else's lungs, right? How much? The question of the balance of freedom and restraint is a regulatory question, and it involves many different industries, right? I think that what we need to do is to deregulate the energy industry entirely, because that way, fossil fuel can compete on a level playing ground with solar. Solar might work. Elon Musk might be able to actually do it. We don't know. Because the problem is that where the government is putting their thumb on the scales and saying that this is an efficient form of energy. Oh, but this might be, okay, well, so we're going to subsidize this. Oh, that doesn't work. Oh, okay, so we're going to come back over here. So what we need to do is get the government out of it. Because do you pay for clean water? You do, right? Right? Would you pay for a clean environment? Yeah, of course you would. Right? I pay to live in the United States, not in China, right? Where smog is horrible and the government treats their environment like hell. Do you know what the #1 polluter in the United States is? It's the government. In Missouri, for example, we have a town called Republic. I get asked this question all the time. The Manhattan Project had plutonium waste that was left over, and they dumped it into a lake in Missouri. Nobody lives out here. Well, now people do. And they're getting radiation poisoning and cancer, right? So when the government pollutes, who do we go and complain to? The feds, and then it takes them years and years and years to actually act. But if a private actor pollutes, you have the right of recompensation. You have the right to sue them. So we need more private property, less government.
Can I get a show of hands for questions, and we can wrap up and move over into...
Yeah, make sure we get them from people who haven't asked them yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
You discussed the federal judiciary and Trump's appointments going into the future. As a potential senator who would be confirming nominees, what is your stance on judicial originalism?
I consider myself a textualist, right? So the problem with originalism is it splits into two different concepts, right? Original intent and original meaning. And I find that to be a little too abstract. I like the concept of judicial textualism, because what textualism says is that the plain words on the paper are what it means. Because, for example, the 14th Amendment, which has been used for wonderful things and very bad things, the 14th Amendment was written in order to apply to the people who were not citizens, who were slaves, right? But now, broadly defined, the federal government can't issue certain proclamations that affect people who are non-citizens who are here, right? Even if they weren't former slaves, right? So if we had judicial originalism, then the 14th Amendment could never have been interpreted to apply as broadly as it has today. Frankly, I think the 14th Amendment is one of the most libertarian amendments of them all. They've saved the 13th Amendment, no slavery, but the 14th Amendment is actually a really good example. So I don't really ascribe too much to the concepts of originalism and original meaning and original intent. I'm much more of a textualist because I like the concept that we take the plain language of the words, what they mean on the paper, and I would like to find justices of the court who ascribe to that, because I think it broadens our definition of freedom. Justice Gorsuch, I particularly think, was a wonderful pick, not just because of his conservative bias on many issues, but because of his broad definition of civil liberties in terms of privacy. Justice Gorsuch has an expansive definition of privacy that applies not just to you and your homes being free from unreasonable searches and seizures, but also in cars, right? Because right now you actually have fewer rights in a car than you do in your home. But Justice Gorsuch would like to see us expand that, not just expand that in a car that you own, but in a car that you might be borrowing, or a car that your friend might be renting. Right? Because there's one case in front of the Supreme Court right now where there was a man, and he had a rental car, it was his friend's rental car, and he had a bunch of weed in the back, and frankly, they committed a search that they think that there are some people arguing was unconstitutional. Right? And I happen to agree with him. Justice Gorsuch agrees with him. So having someone who's a textualist who has broad definitions of civil liberties, that's what I want in my judge. That's what I'm looking for. So thank you for that very good and very intense analytical question. Really appreciate that. I never get that on campaign trail.
You mentioned the book 1984 written by George Orwell. I'm wondering how you would respond to somebody who actually believed in that style of government in that book, if you want to call it Big Brother government, how it's voted.
Punch that Nazi. Just kidding. You know what? I'll talk a little bit about 1984 for just a second because it's something that I see that's happening right now, especially with the media. Did you see that guy who quit Fox News the other day? And he said, "Oh, it's a propaganda machine and all this kind of stuff." I think somebody called Twitter a perpetual rage machine the other day. And in 1984 in George Orwell, they talk about the 2 minutes hate. People can be easily controlled if they can be made to demonize the other, the outsider, the foreigner, the enemy, the opponent, right? So that's what Twitter and Facebook, that's what these social media organizations are all about, right? And I know what your question is, you know, how would you like respond to someone like that? But I just want to get this concept out because I think it's really key. Is that we are all now locked into this perpetual rage machine, and we are being controlled like sheep led to the slaughter. We are so divided amongst one another, told that we are the enemy, right? But here's the thing: we are all Americans, all right? We all believe generally in the broad concept of liberty, the concept of liberty and of freedom, right? How we get there, I think we disagree many times, right? Bernie Sanders thinks one way, I think completely almost the opposite. But he still agrees with us on some civil liberties and certain things, right? So for someone who wants a totalitarian government, someone who wants an authoritarian government, well, you know, did you see what happened to them in Charlottesville? Did you see what happened after it was over? They don't book a lot of those people anymore at many conferences like this. They don't get TV spots anymore. Because the thing about free speech is that when you allow it out of display, it allows the rest of us to take a look and to make a decision based on reason. Winston Churchill once, I think, famously said that Americans are always known to do the right thing once they've expended all the other options. I believe Americans will do the right thing once we're given the options. But when we're censored and we're shut down and we're banned and points of view are being discriminated against, and we don't have a public forum that allows for open and honest debate, then we trend towards that. Then we trend towards 1984. So my thing is, get it all out in the open, let the idiots out themselves, so that we can know, right? It's just like with the legacy of racism, right, of Jim Crow. A perfect example, right? I despise anyone who would say a black person couldn't come in and sit at your restaurant, sit down and have lunch with you. But you know what? I want to know who they are. If they're going to put a sign out and tell the community that they're an ugly, bigoted racist, I want to know. Because I'm going to go set up shop next door. If they won't bake the gay wedding cake, I'm going to set up the biggest, gayest wedding cake business right now. The truth will out. The truth will save the day. Liberty forever. Thanks, guys.
We're going to try to make sure as quickly as possible and get you guys all out of here. But thank you for coming so much. If you are here for your extra credit, make sure you sign the sheet before you leave. It's out on the front table. We're going to be cleaning up. But if you could just form a line right here, we'll get you up here.
Finish.